If you feel like it's getting hotter, it's probably because it is. The last 7 years have been the hottest on record globally. And this summer in Western Australia, we saw extreme heat and bushfires. And previously, Eastern Australia has been affected in 2018, 19, 20 with extreme heat and bushfires. Australia Institute research has shown that summers are also getting longer. And today we are launching new research and a report about the impacts of extreme heat, but also what we can do about it.
So extreme heat is a really serious issue, and I guess we define extreme heat as a day over 35 degrees and a heat wave as days of consecutive heat. And it is a really serious issue because it has human impacts. So as much as I love a beach day, you know, some people don't live near the beach, some people don't have aircon, people work outside, and it has huge impacts on these people, and these impacts are only going to increase. So some people might remember the 2009 heat wave in Melbourne, which resulted in 374 deaths.
And the reason for that was that it was so hot. It was 44 degrees outside, and then everyone they had to use electricity to cool themselves down. These systems collapsed because there's too much demand, and then you have a vulnerable population without power to cool themselves.
And actually, studies have shown that in Australia, extreme heat accounts for more deaths than any other natural disaster combined.
I think that's a really crazy statistic. If we think about bushfires, flooding, cyclones, all of these impacts that we see a lot of in Australia, combine those and we're still not meeting the amount of heat impacts.
Which shows that while, you know, heat might not be as shocking or make the media, it is a silent killer and it does need to be addressed.
And that's why today we are talking about how to prevent and mitigate heat impacts in Australia. So where in Australia is especially impacted? Well, one place that we should be concerned about is Western Sydney, right? Unlike the CBD of Sydney, which has a lot of coastal breezes, it's slightly more inland, but it also doesn't have the elevation of the Blue Mountains, which it's sandwiched between.
And because Western Sydney is such an area of development, that kind of increased bitumen instead of green spaces really impacts how heat is absorbed and stored in the area rather than reflected.
That's right. So that's something called the urban heat island effect. And actually Western Sydney is 8 to 10 degrees hotter at any time than Eastern Sydney.
As a result of that effect.
And in 2020, Penrith was actually the hottest place in the world. For a day, it reached 48.9 degrees Celsius.
Which is insane. And for people, even when it doesn't reach that extreme temperature, for people with no air conditioning or who don't want to turn it on because it's expensive, people that work in construction or work outdoors, and also in these COVID pandemic times, people who have to wear PPE, that has really serious impacts on their ability to work and function.
And also PCR testing sites were closed down if they're outside, which is added to the backlog. And if you have to isolate at home for long periods of time because of that contact with COVID, that can be really dangerous, especially because it's not just these spikes, it's also extended periods of hot days. So in 2018 and 2019, Penrith experienced 44 days of extreme heat. That means 35 degrees or above.
Yeah, and that adds up to a month and a half of the year, which is huge amount of days of extreme heat.
The prolonged experience and exposure to heat, that's what's really concerning.
And so we did take a look at the data to see kind of how that projects into the future and what we might be in store for. And there's a data superstar over here. Would you like to take us through that?
So the BOM and CSIRO have put together a data set across Australia. And what's really cool about it is that they take trajectories of global emissions and they show you that if we continue along this high emissions pathway, places like Western Sydney can experience up to 46 days of extreme heat by 2090.
Which 2090 does seem like a far away year, but for people like us, that is within our lifetime.
Definitely. Gen Z will feel it. If you're born today, you will only be retiring by 2090. And the good news is that they also do this projection analysis for a low emission scenario. So let's say we start really quickly reducing emissions globally, Australia and world economies do their part, then places like Western Sydney will experience less than 17 days of extreme heat per year.
Which is still high, but much more manageable.
Much more manageable than a month and a half. So let's talk about not only the health impacts, but also the impacts to the Australian economy from this heat. Take that example you mentioned before of Melbourne in 2009. That disaster cost the government $800 million.
And again, to look at some future modelling, the New South Wales Treasury did some modelling on how much heat waves could affect economic productivity. And they estimated that by 2061, we could lose up to 2.7 million days of work per year.
And that analysis is only for 4 different sectors and really only looking at the loss of productivity from heat. That could be a much larger number. And I guess the good news though is that that is for a high emission scenario, right? So again, if we lower emissions and stay on that greener, cleaner pathway, then we would only lose 700,000 working days per year, which is still significant, but it's not 2.7 million per year.
And I think it really shows why we need to stick to that low emissions pathway and really, implement policies to ensure that we can stick to that.
Saving future lives and money for the economy.
So that green pathway is essentially mimicking a scenario where we stick to the Paris Agreement. So we ensure that temperatures are limited to 1.5 degrees. And we're seeing great global action on that. So we're seeing ambition from other countries to reduce emissions and meet and have short-term targets, so 2030 targets. Unfortunately, however, Australia's the 2030 target, which is 26 to 28% emissions reductions, is not in line with that target. And it's not even on track to meet our own 2050 target of net zero.
And the UN has now invited Australia to come back this year with a stronger target.
And that will be really important. We'll really be looking for Australia to increase that 2030 target because as we've shown, it's not just a big high-level goal. It has serious impacts on the citizens of Australia because reducing those emissions is really important to keeping to that low emission scenario where we can reduce heat and reduce those impacts on vulnerable people.
So definitely an opportunity to increase our federal targets. Also, let's talk about the state level. New South Wales, where we've been talking about, it's a huge producer and exporter of coal, which of course fuels heat and climate change.
And while we are seeing great action from New South Wales to invest in renewables, we do also need to see at the same time that divestment from coal and gas and that, moving away from reliance on that.
Phrases like pouring fuel onto the fire come to mind. Really, we want to make sure that we're investing in new renewable industries.
And not undermining that work with coal and gas.
Definitely. I think the other really exciting initiatives that I've seen have been about adapting to heat impacts and making sure we're protecting the community, right? So New South Wales has introduced regulations where all new roofs will have to be light colored instead of black, and that actually reduces indoor temperatures by 10 degrees during a heat wave. So that's huge impacts. At the city level, we can see a lot more green spaces introduced, making sure that there's wind flow, shade for people who are maybe outside using public transport at bus stops. I think there's a lot of really innovative grassroots solutions.
Yeah,
as well.
so it's not just policy solutions. Some of these solutions are coming from the local level and from that grassroots level. So I think we really need to engage with people who are living in these areas and hear what they have to say and how that could be improved.
Let us know if you have any great ideas to protect your communities from heat, or if you've seen policies that are really changing the way that we can manage living with extreme heat, but also reducing our emissions to get there.
And if you are worried about heat and you can feel it getting hotter, what you can do is send a letter to your MP. And you can use our research to back up what you're saying to show that it is getting hotter and you want them to do something about it.
There's no better time to contact your MP than right now in the lead up to an election. You can read the full report and interact with our maps and data online on our website. Also make sure to leave a comment, leave us your ideas, subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Australia Institute TV.